It is the afternoon of July 12, 2007. My name is Don Linky. This is another in the series of interviews for the Brendan T. Byrne Archive being conducted by the Rutgers program on the governor. This afternoon we're going to continue an interview that we started earlier with Daniel and Gaby. Dan, at the end of our first session, we had brought the story up to the enactment of the income tax in the summer of 1976, and your role as chair of the State Board of Education in ordering the schools closed, which put pressure on the legislature to enact the income tax.
So I was vice chairman.
Vice chairman, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Enact the rest of the school reform package. I wanted, though, to digress for a moment, and let's talk a bit about your upbringing and the early days that you remember in Newark and Essex County and in New Jersey.
Well, I came to New Jersey at the tender age of 7. I was born in Scranton, Pennsylvania. My parents are Russian Jewish immigrants who settled in Scranton because my mother had a brother who lived there, and that's what immigrants did. They came where family was. I was born in November of 1933, which I'm just learning was the absolute depths of the Depression. I'm reading a story about the first 100 days of the Roosevelt administration. And November 22nd, 1933 was my birthday. And so I was brought into the world under very trying circumstances. And in truth, all through my childhood, everyone was starving in Scranton and living. The WPA was my father worked on the roads and so on. So when World War II broke out in December of '41, there were lots of jobs because the war industries were booming. And we were told, the family was told, that there were lots of jobs in and around Newark. And so my father went ahead of us. I found a job in the shipyards in Kearney, lived in a boarding house, saved some money, and about 9 months later found an apartment and brought us all to Newark, and that's where I started school and lived until I finished college. I went all through the Newark public schools, went to Newark Rutgers at night.
How large was the family when you moved to New Jersey?
There were 5 children. There were 1.6. I had an older brother who died, and my grandmother lived with us. And it was a typical immigrant family. My parents were working class. My mother was a chambermaid and worked in clean people's homes and things like that. My father was a laborer. The last, I guess, 4 or 5 years of his life, he began to, he ran a horse and wagon. He'd go around the city in Newark and pick up rags and junk and so forth and sell it. And so he kept body and soul together. You know, it's interesting when you think about how security conscious we all are. I don't remember my parents ever having $1 in the bank. They had no insurance. They had no health insurance. Nobody knew what that was. They both worked. And when we got old enough, we worked. I've been working since the age of 13 after school. And that's pretty much in my life growing up in Newark. I was actually living in the Central Ward of Newark, which was largely black. It was the only area in Newark that was black. And we lived there because rents were cheap, and my father's stable was near there where he rented his horse and wagon. And my mother decided that she did not want me to go to high school, Central High School, that there was a high school in the South Ward of Newark called Weequahic High School, and it was largely a Jewish area. And so she lied and enrolled me from my aunt's address in that district. And so I always thought of myself as the first bus student. I took 2 buses up there and managed to do terribly. You know, children are very cruel when you come in at that age and you're not of their class and you're not someone they know. They can be pretty mean. But I worked my way through that, and then I got out of high school, and the Korean War was on at that time.
Well, before you leave your high school days, Weequahic High School was fairly well known at that time in Newark.
Oh, it's probably, arguably, the finest high school in America.
Who were some of the other sort of students who made names for themselves?
Well, the one, of course, that people all know are Philip Roth, the novelist, who was a year ahead of me in school. I didn't know him very well at all. I knew him to nod. The only real connection I had with him was we both played on the high school baseball team.
What was his position and your position?
I was a first baseman and he was a left fielder. I must say he ended up writing a good deal better than I did. By the way, as you know, I made my living from then on as a writer, oddly enough. And he's a vastly better writer, but I was a hell of a hitter. And
what was the perception of him in high school at that time? Was he a loner? Was he outgoing?
My perception of him was that he was a guy that liked to figure out, just for the challenge, liked to figure out how to cut corners and get away with things. And I think it's no more than simply the challenge. I remember one particular instance that impressed me. I remember this. Before baseball practice, we were obliged to run 4 laps around the field. There was a track around the baseball field. 4 laps is a mile. And he would figure out how to run just the right speed so that he was lapped. It was called lapped. What it meant was that the guy who was at the head of the running group would go 1 full lap around, and then you'd be at the head of the, when he caught up to you, you would be at the head of it. So he ended up running 3 laps instead of 4. Anyway, I remember that about him. The school was almost entirely Jewish. I mean, there was one black kid in the class, Willie Pitts. I remember that. And that was 1951 we graduated.
Another Quake student was Martin Greenberg, roughly at that time. Do you remember Marty?
I don't remember him in school. I got to be good friends with him later in politics. He was a senator, state senator. He was a law partner of Brenda Burns. I guess we can connect this archive to that. He married a girl in my class. That's the only reason I saw him occasionally. He was courting her at that time.
Well, I stopped you from proceeding with the Korean War chronology. Why don't you pick it up?
Well, what happened was that I wanted to, I decided, probably sometime about 6 or 8 months after I got out of high school. I had no intention of going to college. Nobody in my family had ever gone to college. But some friends persuaded me. I was working in Bamberger's then as a messenger boy in the advertising department. And one of the people in that department persuaded me I ought to try to go to college. And of course I had no money to enroll full-time during the day, and so I went down and enrolled at night. And I then thought that I would try to get a student deferment from the draft. The draft was in place at that time. Obviously we don't have it now, but see if I couldn't finish college before I had to do my military service. And when I got there, they said that you could not be considered, you could not get a deferment unless you were a full-time student, which meant you had to carry at least 12 credit hours. I went back to the school and asked if I could carry 12 credit hours at night, which meant I had to go 4 nights a week in summers and so forth. They took a look at my high school grades, which were terrible, and then they laughed. But that's when I first discovered my capacity to persuade people to do things. And I talked to them about my desire to stay out of the draft and finish school. And I was the first in the family. I really put it on pretty thick. And they said, okay, we'll let you in on probation. But if you stumble at all, you're out. Anyway, I didn't stumble. As a matter of fact, I was forced to finish school at night in 4 years, which was in those days, maybe even today, unheard of, because I had a full-time job working in advertising, and I was also working one night a week, Wednesday nights and Saturdays, as a sports writer for the Star-Ledger, which is another job I talked my way into. So I had my hands full for 4 years studying, and my father, about midway through that, my father died suddenly, and I became kind of the breadwinner of the family. But that's pretty much my experience. I then, in my senior year, re-met a woman who was a year behind me at Weequahic, and we fell in love and we got married. And right after I graduated from Rutgers, I lost my deferment and went in the Army.
Mm-hmm. How was your military service?
I'll tell you a funny story, which is probably characteristic of me. One of the things I always remember bringing home my report cards when I'd look at them from school, there was some version of the following phrase all the time: Daniel does not respond well to authority. And I did not respond well to authority in the Army. I did get into serious trouble, but it was a whole comedy of those kinds of errors, and I was happy to get out.
Mm-hmm. How long were you in the Army?
I was in the Army. I was in the reserves. I was on active duty for 6 months, and then I served another 4.5. It was a 5-year commitment, so another 4.5 years.
So you come back into civilian life. What did you see as your options in terms of jobs and career path?
Well, I already was fixed on a career path before I went in the Army, because what happened was that while working at Bamberger's, which was my first job out of high school, I used to carry I used to work for the advertising department, and there were 2 big newspapers in town, the Star-Ledger and the Newark News, and Bamberger's ran advertising in both of them, and the artists and the writers in the department would mock up ads, and it was my job to sort of run them around, take them over to Ledger. Ledger would set them up, then I'd bring them back. I'd have to take them to the buyers to make sure that the copy, particularly the price, was right. And that being curious, I used to read this as I was walking along between the newspapers and the store. I thought to myself, I could do this. And so I would come back in my lunch hour and rewrite the ads and leave them with the director, and he'd throw it away, and I'd come back and write it, he'd throw it away. Pretty soon, I don't know, after a couple of weeks of this, he calls me over. I thought I was going to get fired. He was very exasperated, and he said to me, you're a pain in the ass, but I think you can write, or maybe you can write some such phrase. And he started giving me work to do in addition to the other stuff, and so I developed capacity to write advertising. That's really the work I've done all the rest of my life.
How did you get the job in the sports department of the Star-Ledger, moonlighting also at Bamberger's?
That's a wonderful story. He's still there, believe it or not. Sid Dorfman had founded something called the Dorf Feature Service. And Dorf Feature Service had a contract with the Star-Ledger to do all the school sports. And he had stringers out all over in all the schools, and they would cover the game, and then they'd call in to he had an office on Court Street away from the from the Star-Ledger office. And the way the system worked was he had young men who were sitting there with headphones and typewriters, and then just about suddenly, all at the same time, all of the stringers would be calling in with the scores and the descriptions of the games, and these guys were pounding away and so forth. I didn't know anything about that. I had the illusion of a sports writer, sort of going to the games and palling around with the players, and I thought that was wonderful. I don't think I was more than 18 years old. Well, one day I found out, amazingly, that Sid Dorfman's father was a man who was the salesman for the company that sold my parents the fuel oil that we burned, at home. And so I kept pestering him when he'd come every week to pick up. We used to pay him $1 a week or something like that. I used to pester him for an introduction to his son, and he would just wave me off. Finally, he got, what I found in my lifetime is that you can't accept no. And so I just kept going back and back. Finally, he said, "Okay, you have a certain date. Go down and see him." So I thought I was going down for an interview. So I get down there, I tell him who I am, and he hands me this set this young man has here, this earphones. And he said, "Okay, you're going to start now, get started." In other words, he wasn't going to interview me. I could either was thrown into this and could do it, or I was out. And I put this headset on, and I sit down in front of the typewriter, the phone rings, and here's a kid telling me, you know, Montclair beat Cedar Grove, blah, 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 and starts basically reading off the box scores and describing the highlights of the game, and I'd write the story. And Dorfman was sitting in the middle editing all of this. And there were about 5 guys around him, sort of in a semicircle, close enough so when you're finished, you'd rip it out and hand it to him, by which time the phone rang again, and there you go. So I must have done 20 stories. It seemed to me I was there 10 minutes, and I was there for 3 hours. What would happen was you would basically get there was a big rush of getting the afternoon games. Then there was nothing to do, so you'd sit around kibitz with these guys. And then if there were evening games, you'd get those as well. Well, I survived. He gave me the job, and I stayed there until finished school. I got $5 a night for doing that.
And I guess at that time, no one saw any potential conflict with your role at Bamberger's as an advertiser at the Ledger? Or
no, I left Bamberger's very shortly after that. I decided when I could at least justify calling myself a writer that I really wanted to work in an advertising agency. That's really where I thought the future was, and indeed, for me, was the future. So I left Bamberger shortly thereafter. There was no conflict like that.
And what...
Not that we'd have cared in Newark in those days. Conflict we got in our mother's milk.
And in your early advertising career, what were the sort of typical clients and the things that you were doing?
Well, my first significant job, it's a funny story. I was working at an ad agency in Newark, and its principal client was Costa Ice Cream. You would not remember that probably, but it was a very well-known brand at those times. Television was just getting started, and there was a television station in Newark. I can't remember what it was, but it was a television that was all live, and so what the commercial for Costa Ice Cream was that there would be a bowl of ice cream, and he'd pick it up and taste it, and he'd say how wonderful it was, and so forth. But the big killer was, under these hot lights, there was no way to hold it so it looked good on television. So they had a freezer there, and my job, in addition to writing the commercials, my job was to go over. And it had to be timed so that when I knew that it was about to break for the Costa spot, I'd have to run in to the freezer, get the cup and the saucer, scoop it out so it was stiff, put it on, and just get it right over there in an instant and hand it to him, and then the camera would go on and he'd eat it and do his thing. I thought it was hilarious. I almost never missed it, but we had a lot of ice cream in that freezer.
Any mishaps, tripping on the way, or?
Not that I remember. It wasn't rocket science getting the job done once you figured out the timing of it. It was okay. You know, I was always benefiting from doing things at a relatively early age, and so I tended to be a very young man around older people working, and they tend to be pretty paternal and give me, sort of help me and give me advice, and so I was very lucky that people liked to see me succeed and would help me do so.
And how did your advertising industry career progress after that, after the initial jobs?
Well, I then went in the Army, as I said earlier, and about 3 months before I was about to come out of the Army, 3 weeks, sorry, I decided, by that time I was married, and I decided I have to get a job, obviously, to come out. And my sister was then working for a manufacturer in Irvington, and the advertising agency for that client, it was a very small shop. It was 3 or 4 people, and the president would come in and handle the account and meet with the management there and so forth. She knew I was looking for a job, and so she got my resume, and one day when he came in, she gave it to him. So he said, yeah, we are looking for a writer. As a matter of fact, they just got their first big account Up to that point, everybody did writing as a sort of second job, and they now were prosperous enough to have somebody full-time as a writer. That's all you did. So he said, however, he said, I'm not going to hire anybody unless I can try them out first. I don't care about resumes, which is very wise, by the way. So he said, if you can come in and work for 3 or 4 days, then I'm happy to consider him. So she told me that, and I went to my sergeant. I was at Fort Dix at the time. I said, I have a shot at a job. If I can get a 3-day pass, I might be able to get it. And he was a pretty decent guy. And he gave me a pass. So I went in. My wife was then living with her parents in West Orange. And so I went back and I reported for duty on a Monday morning. And maybe it was Wednesday morning. It was Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. At the end of the day, on Friday, when it was all done and I had to go back, I went in to see him, and he said, in effect, you'll do fine. And he hired me. So I had a job waiting for me when I went back and went through the process of getting discharged and came back and started at the ad agency in December of 1956. Or 57, I'm trying to remember now. I don't quite remember. The agency then was in Newark. Because it had gotten this big account and was growing, and people were then at that point starting to move out of the city, they moved to Springfield. And so I reported and worked at the Newark office for the last 2 weeks of that year. And then beginning in January, reported to Springfield and stayed there for the next 50 years.
You recall what that big account was?
Yes, it was Engelhard Industries. It's a very big account. It still is a major company, as I recall.
Of Charles Engelhard. And,
Charles Engelhard, an interesting story, I hope, is that in 1968, when I was in the McCarthy campaign, and we were putting up candidates to run for delegate for the National Convention. I was living out in Somerset County, and I was one of the candidates for Eugene McCarthy's slate. And my opponent was Charles Engelhard. Charles Engelhard was, at that point, the largest client that the agency had. And I felt I was bound to go in and tell the boss what I was doing. And I remember he sort of grasped his head when I told him this horrible thing. I said, look, I don't want to embarrass you or cause any trouble. I said, I'm going to do this. So if it's a problem, I can leave the agency and get another job. And he said, well, no, I don't. He said, I think he's a bigger man than that, Engelhard. He said, I don't think it's you do what you need to do. And I did win, and I did run, and I beat him by about 40 votes. That was a whole congressional district in those days. Must have been maybe 8,000 votes cast, and I won. I won on the write-ins. I lost on the machines. But we had come up with the idea. We thought the college students would be supportive of the anti-war effort, and so we made a big effort to get absentee ballots out to college students. So when we looked at the machines, I had lost by about 250 votes. We then realized that nobody had counted the absentee ballots, so we went up to the county courthouse and sat there for a few hours, and sure enough, I won. And I got home, it was about 1 o'clock in the morning. I switched on television to see what was going on because there was a primary in California that day. New Jersey and California, South Dakota had a primary in June 6th of '68. And Robert Kennedy was assassinated in a hotel in Los Angeles that night. Mm-hmm. Any case, I never did. I had a lot of political activity and sat on lots and lots of boards, but never left my day job.
Did you have any further personal or professional contacts with Charles Engelhard after that first race against him?
No. Well, you see, it was considered a shoo-in. I mean, essentially, he was a big contributor. He was a friend of Lyndon Johnson's, the president, and it was an honorary thing. He was being given the delegate position. You go out to go to all the parties. You know how that is. And nobody imagined in a million years that this kid could beat him. And so he didn't campaign. I never debated him. I never encountered him anywhere.
Of course, he and his wife over the years, including during the Byrne years, were major Democratic contributors.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah. By the way, to his great credit, he never said a word about my running. No one ever said, you know, you can't keep the, you can't, nothing like that ever happened.
And of course, for the record, he's been long reported to be the model for Goldfinger in the Ian Fleming James Bond novels.
Yeah. But I must say, I would have enjoyed talking to him, but I was not at that level, even remotely.
Well, let's go back, I guess, to those early years. You've moved out to Springfield with the agency. When did you first get into political activity?
1964. I was living out in Bridgewater, and Johnson was running for, I guess, election, because he had become president when Kennedy was assassinated, and so he had never run. But 64, he was preparing to run for a full 4 years on in his own right. And the Republicans nominated Barry Goldwater, senator from Arizona, and I began paying some attention to it. I was never terribly interested in politics. I began listening to Goldwater, and I thought this was insane. This man was talking, you know, if he ever became president. I was very impressionable in those days. I'm not so sure he wasn't right about a lot of things, but in any case. And so I decided I had to do something, so I went down. We were living in Somerset County, which, by the way, had not voted for a Democratic presidential candidate since 1932. They voted for Roosevelt for the first time, but never again after that. So I show up at this headquarters for Johnson, not knowing that I'm the only person with a pulse in the whole county that was willing to do anything. And so they snatched me up and gave me all kinds of responsibilities. Well, Johnson carries the county, and I thought I did it. Of course, absurd. But anyway, it's like the worst thing that can happen when you go down to a casino for the first time is to win. And so I became smitten with that bug. And in '69, I'm trying to remember exactly how, but I got to know a fellow named Jack Gleason, who was in the Governor Yu's office. And we got to talking. I can't remember exactly how, but he then introduced me to some people in the governor's office, because the entire legislature was up for election in '69. And or was it 67? I'm sorry, it was the year before the McCarthy thing, '67. So I worked on that campaign. I got quite active in the Democratic Party in Somerset County, and what I was doing at that time was taking, it wasn't really very common at that time to use a lot of the professional advertising and communication techniques in campaigns. It seemed to me to make perfect sense. And so I was doing a lot of that for Democratic campaigns in the county. And we were winning here and there. And I got quite interested and very active. And then in late '67, I was increasingly concerned about the Vietnam War as I began to read about it. The explanations made no sense to me. The level of cost made no sense to me. I didn't buy the domino theory, which was, of course, the theory that if we lost Vietnam, that the red hordes would just be swept through Southeast Asia and be at our doorstep. And I think if one examined the history of Southeast Asia, you would see that that was absurd, that the Vietnamese were going to fight anybody that came in there, whether it was the French or the Japanese or us, or the Chinese for that matter. In any case, I then decided that I was going to, McCarthy announced his candidacy. And he entered the primary in New Hampshire that year. It was early in '68, maybe March. The popular notion is that he defeated Johnson in New Hampshire. He didn't defeat him, but he came damn close to doing it. So close, considering this was a sitting president, that revealed the depth of concern about the war. And it was at that point that Bobby Kennedy saw essentially which way the country was going. He declared his candidacy for presidential nomination. And that what began at that point was a three-way battle, because not too long after that, Johnson announced that he was not going to seek re-election, and Hubert Humphrey, who was his vice president, stepped forward and picked up that mantle, the regular party organization. And it became a three-way fight in New Jersey between the McCarthy people who already declared and were organizing, and were largely amateurs. I was one of the very few, what they call regulars, who had left the party. And had gone over to the other side. Bobby Kennedy's people were active, but they had made a decision not to contest the primary. They had an understanding, I believe, with Dick Hughes, that Hughes was going to go with Humphrey on the first ballot, but if Humphrey didn't make it on the first ballot, he would come over to Kennedy. And so Kennedy had made decisions state by state, depending on the circumstances. In some cases, he contested it, and he did very well. My judgment, he would have been the nominee had he not been assassinated. I don't know if I told this in the first round of this taping or not, about meeting with Dick Leone and having discussions with him about how to handle this. It was a very funny animosity that developed between the Kennedy and McCarthy forces. Particularly, the animosity was mostly going from the McCarthy people toward Kennedy, feeling that he was basically an interloper. He had taken advantage of McCarthy going in first and blah, blah, blah. None of that meant anything to me. I was interested in stopping the war, and if Kennedy was more likely to win than McCarthy, then he'd be our guy. I didn't have any emotional attachment to McCarthy. But we realized, particularly I realized, that if I was openly friendly toward the Kennedy people, that there would be a big uprising under me. And so essentially, Dick and I used to meet quietly. And my position was, we're going to go forward and do everything we can and win as many delegates as we can, and we're going for the nomination. However, again, as Dick Hughes said to him, if Humphrey doesn't get it on the first ballot, then I think we have to revisit everything. And I would do my best to, if Kennedy was stronger, to move our folks there. And so that's the way it was.
And was Dick Leone's argument essentially that Kennedy would be a stronger candidate in the general election?
Well, he didn't have to make much of an argument. It was very clear to me that McCarthy was a very strange duck, and that he was not going to connect to the working man. He was not going to connect to the traditional Democratic base. He was sort of detached, aloof, had no organization. He just wasn't going to win. Now, as far as I was concerned, I didn't have any illusions that McCarthy, even before Kennedy came in, I had no illusions that McCarthy was going to take that nomination away from either Johnson or Humphrey. But if we raged enough of a campaign all over the country, and it was clear to the leadership of the party that this was essentially a no-win situation for them, they were going to have to change their policy in Vietnam. I was not interested in changing the president. I was fine with Johnson's domestic policies. I was fine with the Great Society. I just felt that he needed to have a 2x4 right between the eyes. And the only way to get it, at least, and I was an experienced politician back then, the only way you get attention is that you get voters telling the bosses, no way.
Did you have any personal contact with McCarthy or Kennedy, for that matter?
I met Kennedy once. He came for a rally in Camden, and I was introduced to him. It was a very fleeting handshake. I had a very amusing experience with McCarthy, however. After the primary was over, in that primary, we had won 25% of the delegates. And the uncommitted slate, which was essentially a Humphrey slate, had won 75% of delegates. And the whole task, we thought now, was to persuade the uncommitted delegates that the guy they should go with was McCarthy. And we had all kinds of rationales for why that would be good, why he would be a stronger candidate than Humphrey, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, McCarthy was coming into the state one day for some meetings. This was after the primaries. And I had the notion that I wanted to put a meeting together with he and one of the most powerful of the Democratic county chairs, a fellow named Harry Lerner, was the chairman in Essex. I felt that if he made an impression on him, we could persuade him that Lerner, in fact, could have a lot of influence on his peers. And so I arranged for a meeting between myself, McCarthy, and Lerner. And I then sat down and worked very hard to develop what McCarthy's pitch ought to be, with a slant toward New Jersey, so that he made the best possible case for support. And I sent it down there and expected him to be prepared to read that and so forth. Anyway, we got in, sat down with Lerner, and McCarthy immediately launches into a discussion with Lerner about baseball. And we had about half an hour for the meeting. He spent the whole half hour talking about baseball. Didn't mention a word about the arguments I put together. Didn't ask him for his support. I left that room basically knowing that not only was there no way this man could be president, there's no way he should be president. But of course, we had a different level of motive. His becoming president wasn't a great concern of mine. That wasn't going to happen. And
on his side, Lerner didn't ask him more substantive questions about positions or politics?
No, Lerner had no interest in that. Lerner wouldn't know a policy from a badminton.
So he was more interested in baseball also?
No. Basically, Lerner, when a major candidate for a party presidential nomination says he wants to see you, you see him. That's all. He had no intention of going over to his side. He had no intention of taking it seriously, anything he said. There was nothing that McCarthy could say to him at that point that would be of the slightest interest to Lerner. He saw him, that's all. You know how that works. You know.
As you become more politically active, did you personally fear, or did others within your advertising agency feel that this could have some backlash against the business in terms of clients who didn't share your political views?
No, interestingly enough, there was a direct correlation between my visible involvement in politics and the growth of the agency. It had the opposite effect. The more publicity I got, the more my name was in the paper. I mean, basically, while I was considered a rebel, it's not the kind of publicity you get if there's a story about your corruption or your machinations or anything. It's just a man who's standing on principle and going against his own party for his beliefs. And oddly enough, that resonated very well with everybody. It was very clear that one of the principal concerns I had, and that I voiced often, was the corruption within my own party. Most of our clients were Republicans, and they didn't have any problem about my criticizing the Democratic Party. Not just that, but oh dear. Let me turn this off. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Wow. No. So to answer your question, it had the opposite effect. Matter of fact, interestingly enough, I was moving fairly steadily up the ranks of the company, and at that point, when Byrne was first elected, I was executive vice president, second-ranking person in the agency. And after Byrne was elected, there were a spate of stories surfacing about my being considered for appointment to the Commissioner of Community Affairs. Mm-hmm. And the president of the agency caught wind of it, and he basically read it in the newspapers and invited me out to lunch. He took it very seriously. I knew about that animal called senatorial courtesy. I knew I was living in Essex County, and there's no way that the Essex County party would allow me a position like that. So I basically disregarded it. It wasn't serious, but he didn't know that.
Now you mentioned that your wife at this time is a native of West Orange, and her family was in West Orange.
Well, she grew up in Newark. She went to the same high school I did, but after we both left high school, she was they were among the many people in the neighborhood just went to the suburbs.
Did she and her family have any contact with the Burns in West Orange?
No. I think, no, I can't. Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Well, let's continue the story. We're overlapping with some of what I think we discussed in the first session, getting toward your first contact with Brendan Byrne, as you had mentioned earlier, when you attempted to recruit him to run against Harrison Williams.
Right.
Any other recollections of that episode that you wanted to add to the earlier account?
No, I don't think so. I don't know whether in the earlier account I told you that I encountered him pretty regularly because while he lives in Princeton, he's often in West Orange and in Essex County, so I see him at restaurants and things like that. I don't know if I told you about the fact that maybe about a month ago, it may have preceded that he came up to me in a restaurant and reminded me of that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I think you did go into that, and that you had actually forgotten.
Well, I forget a lot. I remember it very clearly when he reminded me, of course.
Okay. Anything else about family or background that you wanted to add before we move on with the Byrne years?
No. It's a fairly classic first-generation story. I remember, I think, again, because of the break in the taping here, I'm not sure if I told you the story about Jimmy Carter inviting me aboard Air Force One.
Well, let's deal with that a little bit later in more detail in terms of your role with Carter. But why don't we spend a bit of time, since today is July 12th, an anniversary in New Jersey of the 1967 riots that affected Newark and Plainfield and Asbury Park and other cities in Detroit and Michigan. And talking, I guess, about the change in urban politics, particularly in Newark, from your days growing up there till today. What do you remember about politics in Newark in your earliest memories? When did you become aware of what the political makeup was in terms of Italians, Jews, other ethnic groups?
Well, I was aware of the high degree of segregation that existed within groups. I don't mean necessarily, when we speak of segregation today, we think of the segregation of black people from whites and so forth. That certainly was true, but when I was a youngster, ethnic groups were very close-knit. They stuck together and they did not spend a lot of time. They didn't live with other groups. And so we had a very clear delineation in Newark when I was a boy growing up. We had 5 districts, 5 wards rather in Newark. It's still the same configuration. And each one of those wards had a decided racial or ethnic character to it, and you tended to stay. The South Ward was Jewish, the Central Ward was black, the West Ward was Irish, the North Ward was Italian, the East Ward was largely Portuguese. And you pretty much, we had 5 high schools, and everyone at high school was in that group, and you might encounter some people if you went to someone else's stadium to watch a game, or if you went downtown to shop or go to the movies. But basically, in the neighborhoods, you knew only people like yourselves. The only thing I can remember very clearly was how racist the city was. It was most clearly and brutally expressed in the police department, which was unabashedly racist and violent against blacks. And there's no question in my mind that it was a police riot that got this thing going and kept it going. But subtler forms of racism were everywhere. Everywhere. I mean, if you were black in America in those days, you could not aspire to a position in the private sector of any significance at all. I mean, you couldn't get into a big corporation and move up. You could be a washroom attendant or secretary or maintenance man, but you couldn't do anything else. And you began to see the segmentation, the segregation of the workforce, which is very rarely talked about. You had the private sector was white and middle class, the workforce. In the private sector, in the labor end of it, they tend to be ethnic, but they were still white ethnic minorities, Eastern and Southern Europeans. But the blacks were pushed over into the public sector. That's the only place they could get jobs. You could work for the government. You could work for the housing authority. You could work for the school system. You could go into the military. But the road upward for blacks who were educated and wanted to make a life for themselves there was only two ways. You could either stay in your community, which were highly segregated, and have reasonably good lives there as doctors, lawyers, storekeepers, merchants, so forth. But you were in your community, serving your community. But outside of that, you were in the government. And it's fascinating to study that and study the impact that had and the end of racism in public education, the end of that had on the quality of urban public schools. It's a very interesting irony here that the civil rights movement and the success of the civil rights movement, which opened opportunities to black people and to women, was a catastrophe for public education, because they had some extraordinary people whose opportunities were strictly limited. They couldn't go outside of it. And so you had people going into teaching, into public education. The caliber of teacher in the largely segregated black schools in those days was infinitely superior to what it is today. And ironically, it was because they were basically being discriminated against in terms of other opportunities. So we fought very hard to end that, and we have this bizarre consequence, unintended consequence, which we're now trying to work out. Obviously, none of us have the slightest regret that we opened up opportunity. There's no other way for us to go.
Were your early concerns about racial divisions and segregation largely born from a concern for social justice, or was there a more personal history to this in terms of relationships? You said when you were in high school you hardly had any blacks in Wequahic. Were there other sort of incidents where you felt, well, gee, these people aren't being dealt with fairly, or did you develop any friends across racial lines?
No, I didn't. You basically would, I said you stayed where you grew up. You stayed in your own neighborhood largely. So my sense of outrage about racism was kindled not because of personal experience. I didn't witness racism per se, but all you had to do was keep your eyes open, and read the stories of particularly the racist Jim Crow South. You would understand exactly what this country was.
And I assume that was further strengthened by the 1967 riots in New Jersey and elsewhere.
No, by that time my views were very firmly set. I mean, frankly, many of us wondered why it took so long to explode. It was not. I mean, they were horrifying. They were the kinds of actions that would push you to be more resolute in what you were doing. But it was no surprise to anyone, and certainly I don't think some people may have been not focusing on it, and it brought it very powerfully to their attention. I can understand that. That was not the case with me. I was focused on it a long time.
Do you recall having any recollection of Brendan Byrne's performance as Essex County prosecutor in handling many of the cases resulting from the riots?
No, I didn't know who he was. I didn't know what a prosecutor was. Actually, The only insight I got into Brendan Burns' life was when he became a candidate, and I was working on literature and things like that, and of course I began to delve into what he had done before as part of what we would have to project during the campaign.
Okay. Well, let's jump ahead where we left off after the first session with the income tax going into effect after the schools are ordered to be closed. Governor Burns' popularity plummets significantly, largely because of the tax. What were the contacts you had? Were you advising him politically, even though you were in this position on the State Board of Education, which is sort of a strange role because you're sort of in but not of the government in a way?
That's right. My relationship with him and with the administration, setting aside the Board of Education, which is a formal responsibility, tend to be in two ways. Informally, individual things that he needed done that required discretion and deniability, I would be useful that way. People understood that I was close to him. And so there was an understanding that they could take a discussion with me seriously because I had his confidence. And so...
do you want to fess up to some of those roles?
No. Actually, there's one area that I always thought was interesting, and it surfaced around the income tax because the most... what shocked us was that the Democrats representing urban areas, the white blue-collar Democrats, were probably the most vociferous in their objection to the income tax. And we knew perfectly well that their constituents would be beneficiaries of that tax. So it was very tough to sort of cut through the logic and get to the emotion and the politics of it. They were against the tax because their constituents were against it, didn't believe it would bring tax relief, didn't believe that it would get anything out of it, and so forth. I have a history in my activities in the party of basically being a defender of the white working class. It always bothered me that suburban liberals, and I'm a liberal and I'm proud of it and I will continue to be, but there were people who made judgments from the safety of the suburbs about the attitudes and activities of people that they did not know and were contemptuous of. And while it was certainly important for us to be advocates for the minorities who were really at the bottom of the barrel, but the white working class was only marginally better off than they were. And there was a lot they did not want to understand. A lot of people of our class didn't want to understand that there is a lot of justification for the white working class being angry, for being excluded from the concerns of society. You know, if you're living in the cities and you don't have an education and you're white and you're first generation, you're going to feel your jobs are threatened. Your wife can't walk from the bus home. Your kids are getting a bad education or being beaten up there, and you're angry and complaining about it. I felt that the party was stupid not recognizing the legitimacy of that without conceding the racist side of it, and to break off communication with these people, because once they did that and once they began to scapegoat them, they drove them right into the hands of George Wallace and Tony Imperial, people like that, who were perfectly willing to give full credence to their complaints. And so I spent a lot of time with people like that, talking to them, and basically you have to understand I come out of a community like that because my parents are working class people.
Well, I think you had mentioned in your first session that you were asked to go to Tony Imperial and try to argue with him about his position on the tax. Any others that you were asked to go contact?
Well, I'm trying. You know, my memory doesn't serve me well. There were a number of Democratic senators who I remember I had go talk to Tom Dunn, who was then mayor in Elizabeth, who was the mayor up in Patterson. I had to go over and talk to DeFino, who was the mayor in, I guess, West New York, wasn't it, or Union City. I could talk to them. I treated them with respect. I wasn't. You see, you got a big problem. I mean, we had a situation where we broke our necks to get Peter Shapiro elected county executive, and he brought in this whole sort of squad of very bright, very well educated, and very superior people who come in and want to tell everyone else how to live, and they're going to reorganize everything, and you're going to love this, blah blah blah. Well, that's exactly the kind of thing that kills, our end of the party. You can't go in and talk to people like that. First of all, they knew 10 times more than these kids did about everything, and if you didn't go in. My point is this: what we were doing was pushing the liberal wing of the Democratic Party further and further and further into the contempt of the rest of the country, because we thought that we were the only class fit to rule, and we would not recognize. Opposition to us was evidence of stupidity and racism and selfishness. No, that's not true. There's other points of view about everything. And anyway, for whatever reason, by the way, I can't say I was very successful with any of them, but they would see me, and they would engage in a serious conversation. And that's the kind of thing.
And you had mentioned the meeting that you had with Harry Lerner and Senator McCarthy. And then later, your relationship with Lerner deteriorated further, where I assume you weren't really communicating very much. Was that all due to your sort of position on the outside of the organization, challenging the organization?
Yeah, it was. I felt strongly that if the Democratic Party was going to earn the respect and support of the rest of the country, that we're the ones who had to stand up and voice opposition to the corruption and the racism in our party. We could not essentially sweep it under the rug, pretend it didn't exist, because sooner or later it will explode either inside of our party or we'll be attacked from the outside quite legitimately. And so I felt very strongly that if I saw evidence of corruption and racism and bad policy, that I had to say so. And of course, when you talk about corruption, then you can't just do that blandly. You've got to name names, and I did. Harry Lerner was an exceedingly corrupt and sometimes violent individual. Harry Lerner had a funny soft spot in his heart for me, though, because I was, Harry Lerner's Jewish, and he seemed to identify that I was a Jewish kid that grew up in a bad neighborhood the way he did, and somehow I'd gone bad by being good.
Well, discuss how someone like Harry Lerner, who you've just colorfully described, gets to the point of being such a powerful figure in county politics and state politics.
Well, you get to be powerful in politics by controlling and delivering votes. And largely in urban areas, you can do that if you have enough money. And you can get enough money if you will tell the potential contributor that when I'm in office, I will take care of you. I will give you a job, I will give you a contract, I will kick back to you, I'll do whatever it is. And Harry Lerner is very good at raising money. And if you look at the pattern of successful, particularly urban politicians, you will find that they were able to sort of swing that nexus between money and votes and empowerment and access. All of those things they handle very well. They're also totally apolitical. By that I mean they don't have the slightest interest in issues. There isn't a good issue or a bad issue. A good issue is one in which most of voters like it, and a bad issue is that the voters don't like it. And so if you want to change policy, you don't go and persuade this man that our healthcare system is wrong. You get enough people clamoring for a change in the healthcare system, so much so that his candidates and his position are threatened by ignoring them. And that's what Lerner did. That's what all the great ones do.
Let's move on. You discussed in the first session Brendan Burns' call to you about requesting that you help a friend of his run for president, and your initial confusion as to who that friend could be, and finding out it was Jimmy Carter. Let's talk more about that and your role in the Carter campaign.
Well, in the beginning, the Carter campaign was considered, Carter's chances were fairly improbable, so the professional politicians had no interest in him. They were trying to figure out who was going to win and see if they can get on board the right horse. And so the people in the Carter campaign were those that were essentially Byrne loyalists. Over time, we got to, I think, know and respect Carter in his own right and for his own positions. I was intrigued by Carter because Carter asserted early on in his campaign, it's unfortunate that he left this position when he became president, he allowed that. But he asserted that essentially the Washington insiders had taken over the party, had disconnected the party from the average person, and that the special interests were using the party's power to entrench themselves and to strengthen themselves. And of course the typical Democratic Party special interests were those that were supporting the better known, more likely candidates. And so he appealed to me and to us on those grounds. His style was quite appealing because he was at great pains to demonstrate that he was an average guy. He didn't have entourages around him. He carried his own suitcase and blah, blah, blah. He was a genius at that kind of symbolism. But mostly in the beginning, it was because of our respect for the governor and our desire to help him, because we felt obviously if the man that he was supporting got in, it would be good for our wing of the party, the reform wing. So
who were the opposing forces?
It was Mo Udall was one of them. I'm trying to think of who the other candidates were. How soon we forget.
Within New Jersey, who were the people you were trying to get on board for the Carter campaign, who were proving reluctant?
We knew that we weren't going to get the... What had happened was that... I'm trying to remember the timing here, but Byrne was becoming increasingly disaffected from Jim Dugan, who was the chairman of the party. So there was a big split in the party between the old line political county organizations and Byrne. And Byrne had what I considered a constituency of conscience for the most part, because he was pursuing the tough issues, the right issues. He was taking the heat for it, but he was pushing them through. And we all respected him enormously for that. And so, you know, it wasn't of interest to us whether he was or was not going to prevail in the fight. He had earned our support, and we felt it was very important that if, you know, my feeling was that if you continue to ask a politician to stand up and make the tough decisions, then when he does so, you don't stick with him. That's a very bad signal to send to politicians. It's all downside as far as they're concerned. So, but mostly the regular party organizations were watching to see who was going to be getting the upper hand in the early. You remember New Jersey primaries at the end. So our politicians have the luxury of kind of holding back and waiting to see which way the wind's blowing before they jump on board. We did not do that. We were for Carter, period. And so we went out and organized organizations. I had the benefit of going back to a lot of the peace people, because I knew them. A lot of people that were in the income tax fight. A lot of people that had already stood up on tough issues, irrespective of the outcome, and say to them, this is, you know, once again, the clarion blows and we're going back into battle. And I was pretty successful in doing that. When it became clear as we approached our own primary that Carter was going to be the nominee, the regular organization started hedging its bets. They had already made some choices for other candidates. Dugan, I think, as I recall, was trying to put together I know who was one of the candidates, Jerry Brown.
Mm-hmm.
Jerry Brown somehow cut a deal with Dugan, and he was the guy that was going to be the beneficiary of some kind of an uncommitted slate that Dugan was heading. And Carter was running against that. The party organization was able to defeat Carter in that primary, but he had won enough delegates elsewhere so that he was unstoppable. And as soon as that primary was over and it was clear that he had it, they then got into Carter organization and persuaded them that Byrne and particularly Byrne, was a liability. And they began pushing him out. And you may recall, we were very upset about that.
And of course, it was somewhat embarrassing that the incumbent governor really didn't have a significant role in the delegation, as I recall.
That's right. It was Dugan's intention to basically embarrass the governor at every opportunity, to demonstrate that he was weak, to demonstrate that he had no influence, to demonstrate that he was on his way out. The wolves were starting to form a circle around the governor for the following year.
Did you have any direct discussions with Jim Dugan at the time about the politics?
No.
He just knew where he stood and what he was up to?
Well, you know, people like Dugan were totally contemptuous of people like me. To them, politics was a profession. And you didn't bother yourself with positions on the issues. You only bothered yourself with who was going to come out on top and where you were going to end in that realignment.
And to the extent that you know, what was the genesis of the split between Byrne and Dugan?
Well, I think Byrne's independence was always stuck in the craw of the county leaders. He was determined that he was going to have the best people in positions. He was determined that he was going to keep the judiciary high quality and independent. He had certain principles. They thought, now, you know, we won. Now give us the goodies. Put our hacks in there and blah, blah, blah. Byrne fought them on that. You know, if you study American politics, you will find that that's exactly what happens. I mean, if somebody, two things happen potentially with a guy like Byrne or Shapiro or Carter or whatever, is either once you get in, you sell out, and then then the organization will keep you there because you're giving them everything they want, but nothing changes and nothing happens. Or you refuse to sell out, and they make sure they're going to get rid of you. And that's what they decided to do with Byrne.
Well, to what extent, though, looking at it from their perspective, was it also a replay of the style that you mentioned with Peter Shapiro coming into office, where he brought in this new crew of highly educated people who were not quite of the background and class of the predecessors? Did the Byrne administration also make those types of mistakes in terms of its style, a sense of arrogance?
Well, I'm sure there were people in the Byrne administration who were arrogant. I think what happened was that when Byrne made decisions about selecting people, he selected the best people who believed that they were coming in and being given a free hand to do a good job. Suddenly they get a call from the county chairman, I got so-and-so, I'd like you to put them on the pad, or I'd like you to see somebody about a contract, or I'd like you to look the other way about this environmental problem, blah, blah, blah. They were talking to the wrong people, because these are folks that are not political hacks who come up through the system. They have options. They're there because they want to do a good job, and if they're not going to be allowed to do that, they'll go somewhere else. And so they essentially were dismissive of these efforts to. And again, one of two things could happen. If their boss didn't back them up on this, and he did, they would essentially, if the boss didn't back them up, they'd have to either give in or leave. If he did back them up, then they felt secure in saying no.
Mhm.
And then this made them, and maybe they were arrogant in the way they said no, maybe they just said no, but the point is that these guys did not get what they think they had earned and expected, and what the system, essentially, the way the system worked.
How much personal contact did you have with Carter as a candidate or his other sort of key political people?
I had a lot of contact with Carter as a candidate. What happened the first time around, because we were in so early, I had developed kind of a relationship with him, and so I would be with him whenever he came in to campaign the state.
What was your take on him personally?
I think he was very intelligent, very well read. In fact, scary how smart he was. And I have to say that that's a reflection of my own bigotry. When I heard Georgia, I think dumb, you know,
Mm-hmm.
shame on me. But actually, he was brilliant. He was a very astute politician. His wife was a very astute politician, maybe more so than he. He had his eye squarely on the ball, and he had a very steely kind of determination. Once he had decided to do something, he weren't going to move. I thought all of that, I found that all that very reassuring. I felt that if he had principles and he was determined to see them through, then he would make the changes that we had all thought needed to be made, that he said he would make.
Some of the criticisms that later came to haunt him as president were that he was a micromanager, that he didn't delegate well, that he lost his temper sometimes. Did you get a feel for that during the campaign?
He was not a micromanager, but that was because of the circumstances. He had limited resources in the beginning, and he was running in 50 places, and you can't micromanage that. Not just that, but we were raising our own money and we're finding our own volunteers. It's different from someone who sits on the top of a pyramid with vast resources and the force of law behind you. You can probably micromanage. But he wasn't going to do that then. So I did not experience that. I occasionally saw some flashes of anger. I did see that, yeah. Other than that, my recollections of her were, you know, there's a very, again, because of the break in this narrative, I don't know whether I told you the story about his coming to Newark, to the hotel when we met with Adebato.
No, I don't think so.
Very interesting. There was a priest in Pittsburgh, a Catholic priest, who was very involved in working with blue-collar neighborhoods, trying to stave off the reaction and the racism in the neighborhoods and so forth. He was doing a lot of the same work Steve Adebato was doing in Newark, in the Italian neighborhoods. And they got to be good friends. And this fellow, Gino Baroni was his name, he asked Pete if there's any way he could meet Carter. And Steve called me, and I called the headquarters, and we made arrangements for the three of us to meet with Carter at the Robert Treat Hotel on one of the days he was campaigning. And we were told to come there at 6 o'clock. We went up to his suite, and he wasn't there yet. He was still out campaigning. And so we waited, and 20 minutes later he comes in. I introduce him around. There's a knock on the door, and in comes Carter's dinner. It's on one of these carts, and he sets up a table, and we all sit around it. And Carter has ordered a steak, and what he does is while he's talking, he takes his knife and cuts the steak into 4 parts, puts a piece of it on each of 4 plates, doles out the potatoes and the vegetables and whatever, and passes it all around, and we have dinner. And to this day, Adebato still talks about that. Now, either he intuitively and without thinking and did that very charitable Christian thing, or he thought to himself, I'm going to give this guy an experience he'll never forget the rest of his life. I mean, I don't know. He is a very interesting combination of qualities. He could be very calculated, very cunning, very tough, very angry. He could be gentle and compassionate and understanding, all at the same time. I mean, I think Scott Fitzgerald said that the sign of a first-rate mind is the capacity to hold two conflicting ideas at the same time. So he's a very complex, very interesting man. But that was a very telling experience. There was nothing he could have done that would ever have emblazoned himself in Steve Advato's psyche than that.
With Carter's election, did you have any thoughts about possibly going to Washington or taking a federal job?
No, never, never. You know, my insight into the first Byrne administration, which is really the first time I had a close-up insight into government, persuaded me that I never wanted to do that.
That someone would come out of the woodwork to knife you in the back in terms of an appointment, or that it just wasn't worth the trouble?
I was spoiled by my experience in the private sector, because in the private sector you have a hierarchy and rank, and there's somebody with the authority and the responsibility to perform a task, and that person is given the responsibility and the authority, and he or she proceeds to do it. At the end of that process, you've either done it well and you're rewarded, or you've done it badly and you're punished. I like sort of clean, clear context of living that way. And that's pretty much a reflection, not of the big corporates. The corporates still have a lot of politics, but at the level that I operated on, small business, that's the way it worked, and I liked that. It was clear to me that I could never do that in the government.
Well, in any event, now that Jimmy Carter has become president, you and Brendan Byrne, as early supporters of his candidacy, are significant political figures in terms of relationships with the White House. How did that work? Did you get consulted on major appointments, or did that mostly go through the governor's office? And was there any consultation at all?
I was not a significant player, because what happened was that, as I pointed out early, at the end of the campaign, the anti-Byrne people came in and took over the campaign, took over the relationship. Carter, who's very calculating, that's the side of Carter that I was talking about, decided, well, there was a battle for the Democratic Party in New Jersey, and Dugan won, so I don't need these people anymore. Mm-hmm. And it was, in my opinion, I think Byrne did not get anything like the respect and credit and recognition that he should have gotten. I didn't care about myself, truly. I was never going to go to take a job or have anything to do with him. And so this got even worse with Byrne's steady decline because of the income tax. He was more and more a liability to the conventional politician.
Well, let's take it from there. He's declining in the polls to the point where many people think he's not going to run for re-election. You're in the private sector now. I guess totally you don't have any official appointments in the state government. What was your role in the re-election campaign?
Well, once again, by the time it came around, the Iran hostage, we had 26% crime rate. I mean, Carter was on his way out. And so all of his fair weather friends, Dugan and those guys, began abandoning him the way they abandoned Byrne. And now all of a sudden his former supporters were being wooed by the campaign and asked to take a role in it and to help him get reelected. And I decided that I would do that despite what I thought was pretty shabby treatment up to that point. And I did so because I, once again, thought his opponent was a dangerous guy, Ronald Reagan. That was 1980. And so I became chairman of the campaign again. This time, nobody was jockeying to take that away from me because they thought he was a dead man walking. Interestingly enough, we could not sell Carter in New Jersey. We lost 2 primaries and 2 general elections. Carter did. in 76 and 80.
Jumping back to Byrne's re-election campaign, how active were you?
Very. Very.
In terms of the day-to-day involvement, I assume much of it dealt with the message and the advertising and the logistics of getting out the campaign theme and strategy.
No, not so much that. There's a sense that because of the work I do in the private sector, which is communications and so forth, and public relations and polling, that's what I do in politics. I don't do that in politics. The role I play in politics is organizing citizen groups. I began basically because of my criticism of the party early on, or frankly throughout most of my time in politics, my criticism of corruption and so forth. I did not have a good relationship with the unions, particularly because it started out during the Vietnam period where the unions were very supportive of the war and supportive of Johnson and so forth. So I didn't have the best of relationships with either one of them ever. My role was to essentially go out and set up chiropractors for Byrne and Girl Scouts for Byrne. And
so it was a similar role as the 1973 campaign.
Yes.
Although I think we have found in the various archives we've looked through ads that were run by you, or that were little notes saying that Dan needs an answer on this ad text today in order to place them. So your role is somewhat broader than that.
I think what we did largely there was to place them, but Dick had relationships with people I thought personally were much better than I was at doing that, of doing the creative on the
Dave Garth and others.
Yeah.
Did you have much personal contact with Garth?
No, I didn't.
That was mostly Dick Leone.
Right, and that was fine. I really do think when I saw their work that they were very good at it, and there were other things I could do more productively for the campaign.
Was your take on 1977 in the primary that the anti-Byrne candidates would eventually coalesce into a more single opposing candidate?
I never believe that. If you have any insight into a politician's ego, that's not the way they're made up. Mm-hmm. They're all for, they will concede that it makes perfect sense for everyone to coalesce behind one person, but that one person is them. So there were people who expressed that concern. First of all, there was nothing we could do about that, so why worry about it if they wanted to coalesce? Number two, I never believed it would happen. Mm-hmm. I think the strategy was, as you recall, the candidates, that they all kind of dominated a county or a region, and that they were going to essentially get enough votes in that, with a sprinkling of votes from elsewhere, that would put them over the top. And they did not need an absolute majority. And so the more people that were in, the more likely any one of them thought he could do it.
In the general election, at what point did you think Brendan Byrne had sort of turned the corner?
There was one incident, if you remember, Joe Lordi was a prosecutor in Essex County. And at some point in that campaign, Ray Bateman, his Republican opponent, issued a statement that suggested that Lordi was essentially looking the other way in terms of going after the mafia. And he was doing so because of his ethnic connections with them. I remember clearly that one night, the night or the day after that was released, John Degnan, who was then, I guess he was counsel to the governor, he became Attorney General in the following administration. But he was very involved in the campaign. Called me panic-stricken, saying, well, this is the end of us. You know, they're going to associate Byrne with Lordi and blah, blah. I said, no, John, this means we've won. He said, how could you possibly say that? I said, because the Italian community in the state is a large voting bloc, and they're going to be outraged at what Bateman is suggesting, that because you're Italian, you're going to be soft on the mafia and so forth. I said, I can firmly predict now that the governor will be reelected. And of course, it just swung that way.
And you see that rather than the reaction to the Bateman-Simon alternative to the income tax as the key?
I think people in politics tend to exaggerate the impact of policy and the subtleties of policy on the general electorate. To me, this business with Lordi was a visceral, emotional thing that touched a nerve that exists in the Italian community. The vast majority of whom have nothing to do with the mafia and are wonderful people.
When the Bateman-Simon plan was announced, were you involved with any of the strategic meetings to discuss how the Byrne campaign should react to it?
No, I was not. I don't recall. I may have been. The Citizens campaign was largely run entirely on its own. What we did was essentially to create 10, 12, 15, 20 citizen organizations. We would determine what issues we wanted to emphasize with them, how we wanted to essentially communicate to them that Byrne's victory would be their victory, and then we just ran our plays.
Dan, one of your other roles in the private sector was to handle the state tourism account. Let's talk a bit about promotion of the state in terms of tourism and Brendan Byrne's special perspective. His daughter is now the director of the Division of Tourism for the state. There's always been this perception that New Jersey has such a negative image. How did you sort of see your role in terms of crafting an advertising campaign to promote tourism?
Well, there were two things. Number one, because I was doing that from a professional perspective, I made it my business to keep my distance from the governor. In other words, there was a chain of command. I reported to a division director, and that's where it ended. I never attempted to reach the governor or persuade him of my point of view or whatever. I was reporting to someone like any other vendor, and I respected that. So I don't really know very much about his attitude. I know this. I felt from the beginning that it was going to be very difficult to affect the image of the state given the kind of resources the state was prepared to put into it. I don't know if you remember this, but those budgets may have seemed large to people who don't understand what an advertising budget really is. But in this state, in order to get across in broadcast, particularly in those days, there was no cable. You had to buy New York and Philadelphia television and radio, and that was the most expensive and the fourth most expensive markets in the country. And so the campaign was always underfunded. Now, the other thing about it is I did not think it was appropriate for us to try in general to affect the image of it. Our job was to try to stimulate tourism and business for the tourism industry, which meant that I felt that we could use our money best by getting literature out to people so that we would have an opportunity for them to sit down and take a full presentation of the materials in. And hard to say whether that worked or not, but
I recall one comment I heard him make, I don't know if he made it also to you, was that he couldn't understand why New Jersey promoted the beaches in the summertime when he thought they sort of sold themselves, that people would come anyway. And why should we spend money on commercials and so forth?
Well, he never said that to me. You know, I felt strongly that the people in the business, in the tourism business, had the best grasp of what to say and when to say it. That was their business. And I looked at when the advertising was being run, and they were all running advertising in the summer. I said, there must be a reason for this. You know, people argue, for example, one of our clients was a large supermarket chain, and all the supermarkets ran their ads on Wednesday. And people would argue with me, well, why do you want to go in a newspaper and be up against all those other ads? Why don't you run it on Thursday when you're there by yourself? I said, because people think about what they're going to shop on Wednesday. You can't break habits like that, not without an enormous amount of money, and why would you? So I never heard him say that, but I would have responded as I just did.
Another comment I've heard him make was that some of his initiatives, like Atlantic City, the Meadowlands, Pinelands to some extent were based more on what he felt was the perception around the country of New Jersey's negative image of people who didn't really know New Jersey very well. I think he's made that comment about Atlantic City, that he saw it somewhat as an economic development measure, but also something that would bring more excitement to New Jersey's image, and also to the Meadowlands in terms of major league sports and the major events and concerts and so forth. So he did have this perception, I think, that image, did develop.
He once said to me that he felt it was important to have large, dramatic achievements in your administration. That, and certainly if you look at Atlantic City or the Pine Barrens or the Meadowlands and others that we can talk about, but particularly those, he was very interested in being remembered for major significant changes in either the perception of the state or the way a region operated or the success and so forth. The interesting thing is that he was really the father of so many of the political reforms of public funding and all of the reforms in the acquisition and contracting and so forth. People don't remember that.
Of course, in his second term did have a series of policy successes, and his popularity, although it was never terribly strong, did improve somewhat after his 1977 re-election. In addition to the Pinelands that we've discussed, and I think we've touched on Atlantic City a bit, and the Meadowlands, in New Jersey Transit and penal code reform and parole reform and many others. Any other issues that you were personally interested, involved in? You continued a particular interest in education reform.
Well, as you know, I've remained intensely interested in education reform, unabated all these years. I feel very strongly that that's a threshold issue, particularly if we don't solve it in urban areas, we will not realize the potential of this state or of this country.
Well, we've talked quite a bit about that, but why don't we discuss further, I guess, if you were czar now, what you would do in terms of New Jersey education policy?
I think first and foremost we have to reverse the power paradigm. Right now, the system the legislature gives the system the money, the system decides how children are educated. And those decisions are almost invariably what is in the interest of the adults in the system. Now that's largely because the teachers union is strong enough to force a set of laws that give them an enormous amount of power. Now that's okay if I have enough money as a parent and I don't like what they're doing in the system, to take my child and send them to a private school, or I can move to a better district. The problem we have in urban education is that those parents do not have the capacity to buy their way out of the system as the middle class does. In other words, the system in the urban areas is a monopoly, and I feel I'm a great advocate of school choice. What that really means is very simply giving the control of the money to the individual parent. And if the parent is unhappy with what's happening at school, if it's dangerous, if it's not performing well, if they see anything at all that they don't like, and they're not getting any satisfaction from the district, they can do what I do, what I have done, which is I take my child and my money and I leave. And the district, when that happens, the district will take care of itself. We're not educators. I'm not an educator. I do know this, that as long as the provider has a monopoly, then the consumer is not empowered, and you will not get a system that works.
Thank you.